You're welcome back. This is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform. And here on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. Let's get to meet my guests for this morning's program. And joining me right here in the studio for the discussion on the electoral reforms and the questions of violence during elections. We have Dr. Emmanuel Akwete, he's Executive Director, Institute for Democratic Governance, IDEG. Prof, thank you so very much for making time to join us. It's been a long time. Great, great. And you will find that in some of the proposals made by the NDC, some of them are issues that you at IDEG have raised for quite a long time, including removing the power from the Attorney General to issue a warrant before an election-related matter or violence could be prosecuted in the court. Also here in the studio is Martin Pebu. He is a rights activist and a lawyer. Alex Segwefia is Director, NDC International Relations Directorate. And Dr. Kwame Asasante, a senior lecturer, Department of Political Science, University of Ghana. Thank you all so very much for making time to join us.
Thank you.
Right. Do we have Doc? Hello, Dr. Asasante.
Yeah, good morning.
Great.
Samson.
Great to have you, sir. Right. So, first, let's listen to the NDC as it outdoored and spoke about the proposals that it intends to bring to reform some aspects of our elections. Let's listen.
In the first, we propose that members of the EC should be appointed by the President in consultation with the Council of State and with the prior approval of Parliament, provided that the chairperson shall be approved by 2/3 of all the members of Parliament. Now we draw attention to a similar independent institution of the Constitution, the Supreme Court, whose members are similarly appointed on the advice of the Judicial Council or in consultation with the Council of State as appropriate, but in all cases with the prior approval of Parliament. In our second flagship recommendation, we propose to the NDC party that the Inter-Party Advisory Committee, that's the IPAC, should be backed by legislation, and that its composition and functions should be clearly spelled out in the legislation. We draw attention to a similar independent body in the Constitution, the judiciary, whose Judicial Council also has its composition and functions spelled out, both in the Constitution and in legislation.
It is trite knowledge that all is not well about our elections in Ghana. Some of the problems began as far back as 1992. Some have got solutions along the way. And for each passing election from the 1992 elections, we thought we were making progress because each election represented an improvement on the previous elections until 2020 came. And you agree with me that 2020 elections has been one of the worst elections that we have had in the history of the Fourth Republic. We did our part as a political party to resolve some of the problems without success. And we made it known to the whole world that we are accepting to work with the outcomes of the court processes, not because we think there has been justice, but we think we have to save the democracy and live and improve upon what we have.
If the NDC is serious about their demands for electoral reforms, they should table it at the right forum, which is IPAC. But if, on the other hand, they think that the media can undertake reforms they are calling for, then they should go ahead with their rantings in the media space. We are not going to debate in their own turf. They should be honorable enough and come back to the table for civilized discussion and debate. The MPP has always believed in the electoral reforms. And if we are to go through some of the reforms that they've put out, you just know that it is just face-saving things that they have put out.
Right. So you have heard Nana Atudazi, Chairman, NDC's Technical Committee on Electoral Reforms. He's a former Chief of Staff, a renowned lawyer in the country. Johnson Asiedun Ketia, General Secretary of the NDC, and John Boedu, who is the General Secretary of the NPP, responding to the NDC. What is contained in the NDC's manifesto? What is contained in the proposals, electoral reform proposals? What is contained in there? We have put them together in a way that you can follow us. We are trying to show them to you so that you can follow one after the other to see what exactly the NDC is proposing that has to be done. There are a lot of things they are asking for, but of course there are some that stick out. So we'll run you through what they are asking, the proposed electoral reforms, and then we'll focus on perhaps what have become the major ones. So we have some slides that we want to show you so that you can follow us with what we have, the NDC has. Number one, you have heard, it is asking that there should be a provision for prior parliamentary approval for the appointment of EC members. If you follow the Constitution Review Commission, you will know that this was a recommendation for a fixed term. Then number two, they say they want a repeal of the requirement for the consent of the Attorney General to be given before the prosecution of electoral offences. This, some civil society organizations have championed for a long time now. The difficulty is that the AG you can't prosecute without the AG's written consent. So questions have been asked. If the person is a member of the governing party, will you get the consent to prosecute? They are asking for specially designated courts to be appointed exclusively for electoral disputes and offences before, during, and after registration of voters and the elections. They want the EC to be allowed by law to apply to the court to remove names of deceased and other unqualified persons from the provisional register when informed by relevant authorities. Then they also want GBC, the state broadcaster, to be made to comply with the Supreme Court decision for it to provide equal access to all political parties. IPAC, the Inter-Party Advisory Committee, should be backed by legislation through an amendment to the Electoral Commission Act, which should spell out its composition and functions. They want spelled out by law the security responsibilities of the EC, if any, the police and the military during registration of voters and during and after voting. Then they want legislation that should bind the chairperson of the EC as a returning officer of the presidential election to afford the agents of the participating political parties and candidates full participation in the collation and of the presidential election results at the EC's National Collation Center. They want that the EC must by law be made a mandatory party to all parliamentary election petitions, just as it is the case in presidential election petitions, and for the EC to be a compellable witness to produce all public election and related material and documents relevant to presidential and parliamentary election disputes. You would know that the recent election dispute heavily informs this. They want the split of the EC into two separate bodies, one major proposal, into two separate bodies, namely an office for the regulation of political parties and an electoral commission by amending the Political Parties Act 2000. They want the mandatory requirement for the publication of applicants for recruitment as temporary EC staff for registration of voters and for elections, and for allowing the public to object to applicants who have questionable backgrounds, excuse me, or have overt partisan biases. And this must be strictly complied with. They want the EC to be made to comply with the requirement for each political party participating in an election to be provided with a copy of the final voters' register. The EC should make sure that recruitment for the various categories of election officials is made as non-partisan as possible. The EC should give wider publicity to the annual calendar of its activities and events at the beginning of an election year that it publishes, and ensure that all participating political parties are aware of it. The EC must ensure that printing houses entrusted with the printing of election materials have equipment that can print pink sheets with duplicates that can contain all the names of the candidates on one sheet when written upon. The list of all polling stations to be used for an election with their names, code numbers, and locations should be published in the Gazette and as supplements in the state newspapers not later than 30 days to the elections. They also recommend that the EC should print the replacement statement of the poll form and declaration of results form in a color different from the original ones in order to distinguish them. The BVD printouts for each polling center should be given to each political party agent or candidate's agent and should be posted at the polling station. The regional collation center should be abolished. This requires an amendment to the current CI. Parliament should be given enough time and afforded ample opportunity to closely peruse and scrutinize all proposed CIs for registration of voters and election purposes, and the subsidiary legislation committee especially enabled to object to any provisions where necessary. Now, in this country, this particular job is always done at the tail end of the elections. It's very, very, very surprising. I don't know how that happens. In 1 year, they did it, and after that, journalists were struck out. They couldn't be part of the special voters. The statement of poll and declaration of results forms should be redesigned and simplified. The voting period of 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. on election day must be maintained. The EC should stipulate clear procedures for presiding and returning officers on how to proceed in case of any irregularities occurring during the counting and collation process, such as overvoting, non-matching reconciliation, and mistakes in the results form. The EC should reduce the number of extra ballot papers supplied to polling stations for spoilage and include smaller booklets containing 20, 15, and 10 sheets so that smaller numbers of extra ballot papers can be given out. The EC should establish by CI an administrative dispute resolution mechanism for first instance grievance against decisions and actions of election officials. This one, the judiciary has proposed this almost every election year in their election manual, that it is good to resort to ADR before you hit the court. In particular, an election adjudication committee should be established at the head office of the EC to review disputed presidential election results prior to the EC's publication of the final declaration of the presidential election results and gazetting of same. No court action challenging the election result should commence prior to the completion of the work of the such committee at the various levels. Party agents must be enabled by regulations to oversee the transmission of collated results at all the various stages of the collation processes and at both ends of the results transmission. Such transmitted collated results must be confirmed and validated by the party agents at the receiving end and to be acceptable. Just a couple more. The CI that regulates the election should require the EC to publish details of all election results on polling station by polling station and constituency by constituency basis on its website and in the Gazette, as well as detailed results from all levels of collation, well before the deadline for filing petitions against the results. The regulations requiring that the returning officer at the constituency collation center should give a copy of the summary of result sheets of the constituency to the candidates or their representatives should be strictly complied with. The electoral, this is the final one here, the electoral officials who breach the rules should be sanctioned. I think the present CI provides for that. The EC itself should also be sanctioned for non-compliance with its legal obligations, including applicable rules and regulations. And very finally, there must be a public broadcast of the presidential vote collation process at the EC head office as and when the constituency presidential results are received. So, we decided deliberately that we should take all of you, everybody who is watching and listening, through all the 30 pieces of recommendations for reforms that the NDC is making. So the NDC, as you know, is represented here in the studio by its International Relations Directorate Head, Alex Segbefia. So give us an idea. This is too much, isn't it? You do these things piecemeal.
Not. I just was on a program. First of all, good morning to you and my colleagues, my seniors in the academia world, and also good morning to your viewers and listeners. I think the first thing is that many of these proposals are not new. They have been on the table in different guises, in different places. And all that has happened is that the NDC has looked at all that has happened, especially in the 2020 election, and put together a document, tinkered with a few things, and brought it out. And these are our proposals. We accept.
There are actually 34 of them.
34 of them,
right.
not 30.
Right.
Actually 34 of them. And we accept that when we went round, we didn't just, in order to make sure that it wasn't seen wholly as a partisan issue, we engaged CSOs first. We have engaged the diplomatic corps. We have engaged religious leaders, both on the Muslim side and the Christian side. We have engaged the Peace Council. We have engaged TUC, both labor unions that are out of it and those that are in. So we've done a very broad consultation because we accepted from the onset that people may have different views on some of these proposals, and we would even have to tinker with it. So when we did write to the EC, we explained that at a later date, we might have to send a final document taking account of all the issues that we are getting from the public, if I can put it in those, or from the general populace and other organizations that we meet. And we've had quite a few. But I think the important aspect of this is that these are recommendations which can be put in possibly three very broad categories: short-term, medium-term, and in some cases, long-term, because of the manner of implementation. So, but we divided them into two broad categories initially. And the first category was those that are not directly in the domain of the EC, but fall into the area of some form of legislation or amendments to our constitution, and that the EC may not be directly responsible for. And there were 10 of them in our Part A. Then we put the other 24 as items which the EC has direct involvement or responsibility, may also involve legislation, but the EC would be the initiators or be responsible for them. And then we felt that they should look at those as well and see how best they can deal with it. And that's how the 34 came about. I don't want it to be seen also in isolation because, as you know, the EU also came up with a whole raft of recommendations, I think 20-something odd. And they were even concerned that in 2016, after those elections, they made various recommendations, 20, of which only 2, in fact, they say 1.5, but let's say 2, were actually implemented. And they were not even sure whether they should bother doing this one. And we made it clear to them that no, they should, because our democracy is growing and there's a need for change as we go along. I think that the issue that has been raised by the EC as to where to place it, I want to deal with first before I even get to the recommendations. Because the EC says, table it at IPAC. And I think that their communication should be more streamlined. And what do I mean? They could have put out that communication in a totally different way, which wouldn't have created any controversy. And what do I mean? When you read the communication that came out, for me, it is clear that they looked at the document, because they are able to say that there are aspects in it which they are not responsible for. How do you know that you're not responsible for something if you haven't read it? So it was read and considered, in my humble opinion. And then a decision was made. So the first communication should have been, we have got your documentation, we have read it and considered it. Unfortunately, there may be some things that is not within our domain. There are other things that we may be able to look at, but we would humbly request that you come to IPAC and table them. Now, that is objective, non-biased communication. Everybody is clear where you are and what you are saying. But to, in the one breath, say something, and in another breath be saying another, it almost gives the impression that you are stepping into politics, which is unnecessary, because you are an independent body. And you stressed on your independence to the point where IPAC itself has become an issue as part of the recommendations. The whole point being that you are independent and nobody can actually tell you what to do or not to do. You can advise, but I don't have to take it sort of issue. And yet at the same time, in the same breath, you are saying, come to IPAC and table it. The two, for me, don't actually match up. In any event, the recommendations involve IPAC. So IPAC cannot sit and judge itself as to whether or not. There's also another aspect. Actually, IPAC is run by and put together and convened by the EC. IPAC does not have a secretariat. So if you really want to write to IPAC, are you writing IPAC care of the EC, or are you writing to the EC to deal with? The other aspect is that let's not mix independence and public duty. You are independent, but anybody in Ghana can write to the EC and say, we want recommendations, the way you are running this aspect, please look at it and decide whether it should change or not change. Whether you're a political party, individual, lecturer, civil society organization, if you send in your recommendations, it should be considered, I like to think. It doesn't affect your independence. But if there's something in there that is useful, that you can work with, it behoves me, you, according to me, to actually take it on board and see what you can do about it. You don't just say, well, because you have a forum which I think you should go and raise it at, if you don't raise it there, I'm not going to consider it. That is the impression that is coming from the communication. And so that's why I say that their communication process is actually not the best for all these reasons. They could have done it in a way which would have been palatable, as opposed to confrontational with the NDC's position, especially since it's a document of recommendations and the EC has also done its recommendations, etc. The EU. The EC itself has brought recommendations. Who brought the recommendations to the table? The EC itself. So anytime they sit and see something that is worthwhile, they should take it and bring it to the table and say, we are thinking of doing this A, B, C, or D. So please, my first port of call is that they should consider it seriously. And regardless of whether the NDC is at the table or not, if it is good for Ghana, implement it. After all, NDC is not the only party at IPAC. We have so many parties at IPAC that is untrue. So table it. These are recommendations that have come. Look at it. And if collectively, and the EC itself sees that there's merit, and can I say at this point, that a lot of we haven't been anywhere where the content of the document has been challenged. That is the beauty of it for me. The content on most of the issues has been accepted as very useful document. A lot to learn from. Because actually, most of it is not new. They just love the fact that it is now coming from a political party itself to push. Now, if I can deal with the recommendations themselves. There are 34, but 34, you've done 30, but I just want to deal with just a few because of time.
No, we will come to zero in on the main ones that we all know that stick out.
Okay.
The EC held a forum to review the 2020 elections.
Yes.
This was the most appropriate forum for the NDC to bring these proposals. You don't agree?
Not under the current format. Leading up to the 2020 elections, we had a number of press conferences, a number of visits to IPAC, a number of issues. We are still waiting for someone to give us 2 recommendations or issues we put down before IPAC, which were accepted. You also have to understand that, therefore, leading up to the 2020 elections, it was a simple case as far as we were concerned at the NDC of, you can have your say, but we will have our way. And we think that that is a complete movement from what IPAC used to do. IPAC has always worked on the basis of consensus. From 96 or from 94 when it was put in place. And it's important for people to understand the genesis of IPAC. In 1992, the MPP boycotted the parliamentary elections. So in Parliament, you only had a number of independent candidates, 2 small parties, Eagle and one other, and the rest was NDC. We had an absolute complete majority. And if you wanted to use the Parliament to set the rules and deal with the CIs, there would automatically be a perception of bias because we were the majority. great minds sat down and said, we have to find a way to rectify this, to ensure that the largest opposition in the country had a voice at the table where rules were going to be made to actually deal with future elections. That gave birth to IPAC. Put under the EC, bring all the parties together, bring civil society into it, bring our development partners into it. Let's put together proposals. So you will find that between 96 and 2000, most of the changes we had in our electoral process were from the MPP's rank, the minority. And Afarijan had a knack of getting us who were majority to understand that if we were going to build our democracy, actually, you should be listening to the opposition more in those circumstances than you who actually have the power. So we moved from opaque ballot boxes to transparent ballot boxes, from ID cards without pictures to pictures, black and white pictures, from black and white pictures to colored photographs, from colored photo, even biometric. It was when the MPP was in opposition through the Dankwa Institute that 2012 biometric was brought about. They were in opposition. It was brought about through IPAC, debated, argued, and consensus was arrived at. The idea was looked at, good idea. We didn't even have the time, but we pushed it because we wanted peace. So all these changes have been brought about through IPAC. And there was no voting. This is very crucial. There was no voting. Consensus building, if there were actually issues that came there, and when there was so much rigor, Afarijan would say, put it on the back burner. We'll come back to it again.
So the reason you don't like the idea of being invited to bring this to IPAC,
yes,
is that there'll be voting?
It's one of the reasons. Because we take the view that, and that is one of the major recommendations. You see, who decides who is a political party or not? The EC. And the EC cannot be creating political parties that don't. We are, when you talk of PNC, we know what they've done. When you talk of CPP, we know. But I don't, if there are how many some of the names I've never even heard before. To be frank with you, I didn't know they existed as political parties. They are all at the table now.
99% of the entities you call political parties in Ghana today don't fulfill the law requiring an entity to be accepted to be a political party. So over 99% of the entities you see as political parties on the EC's list are illegal entities violating all the electoral rules, particularly the Political Parties Act 2000. They breach every part of it, and yet they exist. But you have accepted them over the period.
Samson, and let me give you some justification for where we are. I don't disagree with anything you said. Actually, you're right. Throughout the whole period from 92 right down to date, the EC itself has conducted only 2 full inspections. The reports are there. And in those 2 full inspections, only 2 political parties complied, MPP, NDC. But we are also...
I've had the opportunity of studying the situation over a period and presenting papers 2 times at the Codeo Fora, which is supposed to go to the EC for changes. And I have always insisted on this, that once they don't meet the barest threshold to qualify as political parties, they must not exist. But they are there. They have been there over the years.
And that the fact that something is wrong over a period does not mean that because it has existed, it should not be changed. You have been screaming for it to change. We have joined your screaming, but not even to the extent to which you have gone. And we say that, look, as far as we are concerned, you can create a document which says that you formed a political party. You haven't met all the criteria. In the next 2 years or 3 years, we expect you to meet A, B, C, D. If you don't have those, we'll scrap you off. It's not a question of scrapping the person off immediately. You can say in the interim, you are entitled to attend IPAC because we need ideas, but you don't have a voting right because you are not actually in the game at the moment. So it's just a question of minds meeting to craft a document that makes sense for all and sundry without destroying the political parties that are trying to now grow and build themselves. You can have a middle road and work towards, and some that are totally unacceptable, haven't done anything. Yes, if they need to go, they must go.
If the EC accepts them,
yes,
will it not still take them through IPAC?
But not if the rules of IPAC are clear as to who has voting rights or not. After all, the donor partners don't have voting rights. The CSOs who attend don't have voting rights. But they are at the table, and their ideas and their contributions, even financially, in the growth of our elections, is clear for all to see.
Okay.
So I'm very clear as to, if you are looking at it from an objective point without looking at the partisan nature of it, it is doable. Okay. And that is why you will see in one of our recommendations, we say, let the EC deal with their primary function, namely voting, and create another body to deal with how political parties are recognized in our country.
We'll come to check the wisdom in that. But Dr. Kwete is on Zoom, and also Asa Sante is also on Zoom. Let me hear from the two of you first. Professor Kwete, preliminarily, what do you make of the reforms as presented, your general view, not to the specifics, and then the fight, so to speak, as to how it ought to be tabled?
Thank you very much. And good morning, gentlemen on the panel. I think, first of all, we should proceed this from the fact that we are 28 to 30 years in this democracy. And so it's long enough a time to reflect, review, and see whether what parties do in elections and in other fields actually consolidate our democracy. Where there are weaknesses, you address them. And the methods of addressing weaknesses will vary. When you take the long-term view, you'll find out that recurring problems probably need some major policy reform. And those that have been more administrative, can be held, done the way they've been doing it. When you look at the reforms you're proposing, they are all not just administrative things, because I think we've all admit that over the 30 years, close to 30 years, we've seen major weaknesses in our multi-party democracy. And the idea that two parties have emerged, very powerful, we call them duopolies by their behavior and so on, also exposes the fact that perhaps the institutions of state that ought to look at all this were not all established at the time. And therefore, if now it has become a matter, that is why the appropriate forum issue has arisen. I mean, if you, who convenes parties to meetings? IPAC initially was an administrative mechanism invented by the EC and controlled by the EC. Frankly, that's why there's no law backing it. Informal conversations that now became more or less regularized, but still there was no need to set up a law and so on. But now you have a situation where you see clearly that some issues, the EC says, go to IPAC, and one of the parties say, well, IPAC really, these issues look bigger than IPAC. We probably have to look at it differently. And then you have others saying, no, one other party saying, no, it must go to IPAC. So the question of the aged, politics, party politics, the issues arising are not like those of 1992 or 1993 or 1995 when IPAC started. But IPAC has been used effectively to drive political reforms. These are bigger issues. Issues of regulation cannot be a matter for IPAC. And by the way, it is not even right that matters affecting multi-party politics should only be discussed by the two parties or reduced to electoral issues. There are bigger issues that must be looked at. The fact that
okay, so we seem to have lost Dr. Kwete briefly. I understand that his situation is not that bad, so we should reconnect with him right now. Yes.
Hello?
Yes, Dr. Kwete, proceed.
Okay, so I was saying that first look at the landscape of parties, and you would find that we have only these two parties all the time. It's a multi-party democracy, a constitutional multi-party democracy. But as a matter of fact, you only have two parties. None of the parties since 2012, smaller parties have been able to enter parliament. And then when you want to understand why, you begin to see that a lot has to also do, not just with electoral rules, but even the design of the executive arm of government and how it excludes parties, including the major opposition party. So if we want to look at the bigger issues they're raising, I think the forum issue, the right forum to discuss, has come up, but here we see a vacuum. Where should it go? I think in the interim, for IDEC, as far back as 2014, we saw this problem and we said there might be the need to create a multi-party democracy commission that must have two tasks. The things that are beyond IPAC, the consultations, the administrative conversations, and they agreeing in a gentlemanly way to implement decisions arrive at IPAC. It's not for the EC to enforce everything. They themselves will go and implement it within their parties and come back to report to IPAC. We call that is a corporatist mechanism. You don't need the law to back it, frankly. You can operate within the IPAC framework. However, if it goes beyond that and you're looking at parties vanishing, disappearing, and only two parties with a certain behavior that is even threatening the stability of the whole thing, resort to violence and vigilantes, armed vigilantes. In the economy, when any organization begins behaving in a way that is considered not to be in the public interest or in the interest of the market, the state acts. And there are various institutions. I'm just drawing this analogy. You have the Bank of Ghana dealing with the banks, you have the Securities and Exchange Commission dealing with others, and so on and so forth. Look at our democracy, there's nothing. You only have EC and IPAC. And the issues emerging are bigger than IPAC, I must say. So in the interim, you would have thought that probably the parties in acting, looking at themselves, the two parties, will probably engage in some bilateral conversation. But if you look at the history of the two parties, they don't easily talk to a conclusion, okay, or move towards a conclusion which is in the national interest. Most often, the conversation breaks down. There's a walkout. It started in Parliament. They will walk out. They're staying dialogue, sustaining dialogue, because there's always debate. The deliberative content is not there, and there is no institution of state that can convene them, has the power to convene them and take them through a process of conversation. That says the national interest requires it, the interest of democracy. We are not just running elections. We're also doing development. We want peace. We want stability.
So what am I hearing you say the EC should do in this circumstance?
I think that the EC is in some difficult situation. If you were to ask me, I think a facilitated conversation between the two major parties who stand on the proposals is crucial, will be important before they go to the EC. You see, the IPAC cannot handle all the issues. And the IPAC over time, since 2012, and I heard, oh my goodness, the first speaker. Speaking about it. Since 2012, or even before 2012, if you observe IPAC from about 2004 or 2008, it became difficult for Dr. Farijan, then chairman of the commission, to get through some of the even reforms he wanted to undertake through the EC. It was extremely difficult. It aggravated by 2012. The only thing they agreed on easily was the IPAC, the biometric voters register. And it was very difficult for him. Then we saw how the violence and the courts and so on.
What should be the nature? What should be the nature of this facilitated conversation between NPP, NDC that you are proposing is a way forward?
I think if you look at the proposals, it's not. I don't see it partisan. I think it's often the case that one side would initiate proposals. And if you look at how electoral reforms emerged in the Fourth Republic, MPP played a very crucial role from 1995, from the inception of IPAC, and drove it as far as transparent ballot boxes, the voters being around to watch after voting, the counting and all that. In other countries, it doesn't happen. In South Africa, after you voted, you go. When the time comes to count, in fact, you wouldn't even find many observers as you see in Ghana. It's strictly the Electoral Commission and a few party representatives, especially the big parties, but they have confidence in the system. Ours is not. So one party at some point leads. And I think that electoral reform is something you cannot deny or attribute.
We all admit that the NPP has led most of the reforms over the period. But like Alex admits, this has always been through IPAC. But now they are hesitant to go to IPAC, where the NPP is inviting it to come and the EC is also inviting it to come, because the consensual nature of what used to happen has changed to voting, and voting by illegal parties, unconstitutional parties that are mobilized by governing parties. When a party is in power, we know that they sponsor and pay some of these candidates to form their parties and become running whatever they do. And they sponsor them sometimes for the purposes of their being at IPAC to sponsor their ideas.
Yes, you're right. And you've articulated it well. So this has put us on the spot, the limitations of IPAC in this particular context, and what it has evolved into and the politics around it. But because there's no state entity other than the EC to compel them, you see, if, for instance, the EC's eminent persons had worked well, the EC would have said that, hey, eminent persons, where are you? These are very big issues that in their own analysis cannot all be contained or handled within IPAC. And there are also questions about membership and procedure and so on. What do we do? So that would have been something the EC could take the initiative.
Okay.
And if the parties agree, they could say, look, the EC has because it's the independent, the only authority on elections.
All right.
But when the matter is not also strictly elections, but goes beyond, who does that? It's a state entity that could have done that. It's usually some bureaucracy. All right. But you don't have that.
Let me get Dr. Asasante on here. And Doc, we now know the basis of the NDC's fears. They, ahead of the 2020 elections, like they suggest, almost every single thing they have sought to get through IPAC, they have lost. They've had to walk out. They've, sort of been compelled to not trust that system anymore. What do you think should happen in this situation?
Samson, good morning once again, and good morning to your viewers. I think dialogue is the way to go. Dialogue, because whether we like it or not, we need IPAC and we need NDC and other parties in there to work and address some of these lingering challenges that we have with our electoral system. So if there is a difficulty for the parties to sit down and talk to each other and discuss issues that are germane to the survival of our electoral system, then I think there's a problem. So I believe that they should continue to dialogue. We need the eminent personalities to come in and then impress it upon all the parties to sit down and talk. That is the way to go.
Now, the NDC did something. It is reflected in the proposals that they have made. Proposals include largely issues that have been flagged by CSOs, including the IDEC, as I've mentioned, CDD, some of them CODEO, and they say they have consulted broadly. But should a party be the one doing this for proposals for reforms? Shouldn't it be superintended by the EC itself or the IPAC? A few years ago, the EC asked for proposals and the parties submitted them.
There is nothing wrong with a party or a member of the IPAC trying to suggest something for reforms. Reforms are very necessary. It doesn't matter where it comes from. You recall that anytime we go for elections, there are problems that we try to deal with. As soon as we are over with the elections, we forget about these things. So I am happy that NDC has looked at all the bits and pieces, put them together and said, look here, Ghana, let's look at this thing and deal with it. It doesn't matter where it's coming from. After all these things are not new ideas. Of course, maybe 1 or 2, 3. The rest have been on the table for a long time. So if NDC is bold to bring it to the table, why not? We need to look at them and then discuss them and see whether there are merits in what they are saying. I think that is how we should handle the issue, than just wish them away simply because it's not tabled at appropriate forum. That I disagree vehemently.
The Electoral Commission says it always wants to be the best, and so it doesn't want anything. It will accept anything that will enhance the electoral process. It calls on the NDC to table this through IPAC. The NPP somewhat, you can say, joins the Electoral Commission to say, bring it through IPAC. After all, you missed. There was an opportunity, the EC called all of us to, a workshop where you should have brought your views. You didn't do that because you were not happy with the EC because of the outcome of the elections and the nature of the petition disputes. What should the EC do?
Samson, before I move on, let me just ask this question and I will go ahead to answer it. Suppose that somebody, not the electoral NDC, somebody else did all these reforms thing and then did all this proposal and send it to EC. Would EC admit them, or just because that person is not a member of IPAC and for which reason is not going to accept that? That argument cannot be sustained.
But is there not a difference? This time it is not somebody else. It is the NDC, which is also at IPAC.
Yes, what I'm saying is that any idea that will improve the electoral process is welcome. Unless, of course, you want to tell us that, look, it should come from a particular group of people and it should be tabled at a particular place, and then we begin to look at it. Otherwise, then we are not receptive to knowledge and then reforms.
Doc, the EC is listening to you, and you have one of your colleagues very recently who is now there. What will you advise them? What should they do?
They should listen to NDC. NDC has, made this proposal. It is incumbent upon EC, if EC really want reforms, to look at them and table it where you want to table it, and invite people to come and look at it, discuss, not necessarily even IPAC. You can even extend invitation to other people to come and look at it and see whether we can make sense of this. Because let's remember that some of the things they put down, as I've already said, they are things that exist already, and they are very good, that will help the electoral process. If time will permit us to go through one by one, we will deal with the subjects in that regards. So I believe it is apt for EC to look at this and then handle it the way it ought to be handled, not necessarily that looking forward to it to be tabled at IPAC before you can look at. Then you are not ready to accept some of these proposals.
Martin,
may I just have a word before you move on?
Please do.
I think that EC has more remits to exercise than IPAC. It has authority. That's the way it convened an eminent persons group. I am not sure IPAC debated it and agreed on the list and so before it did that. So the advisors, the EC could convene. I mean, there are many people who could come in, even CSOs could engage. But this is a situation where EC just has to rise above whatever the conflicts are. It's a big thing. We have elections coming and differently, but at the moment, it's the EC that has the mandate and it has the remit. It could decide on how, in which forum, other forums that it will convene to get this going. Just as it set up the eminent persons group, it could look within and say, okay, let's see how we deal with it. Then maybe in the course of time, we can see how the state creates those structures that are needed. But time is running out.
All right. Yes. So,
I think
Martin, like Dr. Kwete just, plainly said it. We know we can't play the ostrich. The relationship between the NDC and the EC presently is very toxic. Yeah. You feel that informs the EC's posture? And should that be the case?
Oh, yeah. It's reasonable to suspect that it informs the EC's posture. But to the extent that the EC also suggested to the NDC that it should be taken to IPAC, I'll say, well, at least it's a positive step. And you follow the analysis by Senior Segbefia, saying that to the extent that the EC says some of these proposals are not within our remit, that suggests the EC had looked at it, except that the communication wasn't that palatable. So for me, what I like to...
No, they actually admit that they had a meeting. Yeah. So that's not in doubt.
Yes. Okay. So the point I'm looking at is that, look, by and large, to the extent that these proposals don't, they are not new. They are not new totally. A lot of them even came from the committee that was set up in 2015. And you know, the NDC and NPP were represented. I know at that time, Peter McMenu of the NPP was on the committee. Then later he was replaced by another NPP member. The NDC was properly represented. And they came out with some of these proposals, okay?
For example, making the IPAC, giving the IPAC legislative backing.
Excellent.
Has been an NPP proposal.
Perfect.
From its Constitutional Legal Affairs Committee, with Michael Kwe, Ayukwe too on them.
Thank you very much. And the other was, I was just trying to look for the original document. I'm not finding but I'm happy that you brought that. So beyond this, we should look out for the original document and distill all those suggestions that had received broad consensus and mark them so that we know that these ones, the parties had already agreed in the past. And don't forget, for the legislating on the IPAC, even the Supreme Court also gave its blessings to it in the election petition. That's the 2013 election petition. Yeah, Akufo-Addo, Bawumia, and others versus JM. Right? So the Supreme Court said, yes, legislate on IPAC, make it, give it stronger powers. So what are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? You say, so the best way, as I see it, is that we'll distill them. We'll see those that the parties had all agreed to implement. Then it means that those ones should go forward without further rancor and debate.
But suggesting reforms in a manner that's sort of overhauling, should it come from a member of the IPAC, or it should be an EC initiative?
Oh, there are no hard and fast rules about this, okay? There are no hard and fast rules about this. At any point that a citizen gets an idea, or a collective or a group of citizens get an idea, they are free to do so, okay? And this debate like this, I just remember, coincidentally, yesterday I was just reading some history bit. You know, when Jefferson became president, 1801.
Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, Thomas Jefferson. There was this thing about, you know, the debates. He said, look, these debates can get bitter, but the bitterness is a passing cloud. And out of these debates, the arguments, the truth emerges, okay? So it's always been like that, that these two parties, they'll be at each other. But at the end of the debates, we'll get something very tangible. So for me, it's not new. Let's just go on. We've already agreed that there are some that they themselves had agreed upon. Let's distill all of those and hold them to it. That look, these are your own agreement. You know, after they finish, the committee finishes work. It presented same to Afarijan. And not long after, Afarijan had to exit. Charlotte said when she came, she didn't have time to implement. You say, so let's go back to the original. Yes.
Charlotte, Jean Mensah was part of that committee.
Excellent. That's correct.
And she's also part of the CRC committee. She's also part of that.
Perfect.
Okay. So we have actually got the best person to implement it.
Perfect.
And so by your reference to the CRC, the Constitution Review Commission, you are talking about the proposal for the Electoral Commission, as in the commissioner and their deputies, to be appointed in a process that Parliament is involved.
Yes.
Which you are also proposing.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Sam, and that's at page 334 of the CRC this report, where they said there should be parliamentary approval of the these electoral commissioners. Okay, so the CRC, there was a large buy-in, you see. So I believe as we keep debating, we'll see that, It's not just a total new birth by the NDC, but these are ideas that have been in the system and had already been accepted. Oh, yes, last point. If I understand this particular point, the white paper accepted it.
That's
yes,
right.
yeah, the white paper accepted the parliamentary approval.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes, and the white paper is an executive act. I don't see any reason why
Bodies like the CDD have been championing this for a while, and I remember it so well because when it came to appointing a new EC commissioner, as in Charlotte Osei, the NPP spent sufficient time arguing, writing articles in the Graphic, which I challenged them. They were actually asking President Mahama at the time to do what they called broad consultations. And I asked the question, where in the Constitution do you find that broad consultation? The CDD was not happy with me because I said, stick to the Constitution. McMenu was at the forefront. Why will he be against such a thing today? List at least the first 5 of the most important of these to you, and let's try and interrogate them as briefly as we can.
Well, as I said, I'm not going with your list.
Okay.
You want me to use your list?
No, don't.
I think
don't.
In the part A, which does not, this is our national issues, which involve other parties under the EC.
Right.
But as a country, we really have to look at this recommendation, which indicates that in terms of the appointment of the EC, or commissioners, we should do it in consultation with Parliament. So not in consultation, with the approval. You see, consultation means you go for advice. It doesn't mean you need to take it. So you consult the Council of State. The composition of the Council of State with the number of people who are appointed there gives the president in any case some advantage. It actually was a majority advantage before the 16 regions were created.
I remember the president is not bound by the advice.
Exactly, and he's not bound by it. But if there is an approval required, then you can the first thing you will note in that is that even before you bring the person, you will think twice. Even before you bring the person, you really have to think twice.
And two-thirds
majority was issue. Some say, oh, but you never agree on anything. How are you ever going to agree on? But we passed ministers recently. All manner of things happen in Parliament, and whether we say yes or no.
So that is number one.
Yes. Number two,
you want the IPAC to be backed by legislation.
Backed by legislation. Very important. And there are issues with regard
to... If IPAC is backed by legislation, where is the EC's independence as enshrined in the Constitution?
Is the independence of the judiciary fettered by the Council of the Judicial Council? Is it fettered? No. Why can't you have a body like that for the EC, which is called IPAC? So it is doable. It's what you write in the document that matters. But we need a document like that, a group like that, given it legislative backing. So it is not, it's just a question of
There's a difference though.
Yes.
The judiciary has to do with judges. Either they are sole judges or a bench.
Yes.
And when they are giving their decisions, they don't go ask the Judicial Council, should we go this way or this way? Yeah. But an IPAC will say, this is what we want. We are a statutory body, and EC must do it.
Not must. You see, that's why I say it always comes down to wording. Yeah. But it has more weight when IPAC is asking you for something. The answer that was given, which is creating so much, is oh, we are independent, so we don't have to listen to you. That was a wrong response, in my humble opinion. Yeah. You are just agitating the process.
Every EC has said this.
But not in the manner, but not in the manner and the terms. And even with Afarijan having said it, in the end, it was the minority position that was taken. It wasn't the government in power. And I think that's why I drew that distinction.
And again, you want the EC to be split into two. Explain that.
Yes, because we take the view that the group that actually registers political parties and the group that actually supervises whether a party has enough conditions to meet the conditions for political parties and whether they should then even have voting rights at a forum legally like IPAC, should be totally separate from the EC. All the EC will do is new group. Which are the political parties ready for elections in Ghana? We are going to print our list of political parties who are going to contest. Which ones are eligible? And that group will tell the EC. The EC will have no involvement whatsoever in that process. And the EC will then work with what that group tells it as to how to conduct IPAC and work with IPAC. So it's doable. But it takes away the problem that we are talking about.
It sounds like what exists in
all the Francophone countries.
Afghanistan. Charlotte Osei told us about it in the course of last week when she was talking about Afghanistan.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. It is something that is good practice globally. And you have only a singular body like the EC in very well-established democracies over 100 years. But normally, you would have a split between these two, and it's good.
Okay.
So those are the three from the first 10.
Yeah. Okay. So three, hold on. What do you say of these?
Okay.
Appointments.
Yes.
So
IPAC legislated and then split.
Okay. Oh, I think I didn't actually made the same comments, but let's repeat. It is good for the emphasis. Yes, bringing them for parliamentary approval. As I have said, looking at what the Constitutional Review Commission went through before they came up with this recommendation, I'll go with it. It's enshrined, I mean, it's stated
and
here.
the NDC emphasizes that Jean Mensah was part of this process.
Perfect.
And she approved it.
Yes, she was a commissioner.
Okay.
And then also most, especially the, okay, let's come to the legislating IPAC, the second one. That one, what makes me happy about it is the fact that even it originates from the MPP, meaning that it's their baby, okay? So they should be interested in nurturing it because it would help us, right? Yeah. And then separating the role of the EC. It shouldn't
From
be
a regulator.
Yeah, I support it because that's too much. Like you said, if we open the Political Parties Act now, you'll find that a lot of the parties don't have regional office, even districts, all over the country. They don't have offices. They are just Accra parties, and yet they have the opportunity to go to IPAC and then distract some parties.
The EC simply doesn't have time to do that work.
Excellent. So let's just go for it. Let's separate the roles. That would help. You remember GMPC, when we found oil, we saw that GMPC couldn't be a regulator and a player at the same time. So we hived off the regulatory powers and then gave the Petroleum Commission, and GMPC is a player.
Okay.
You see, so this one too, we should.
So if you're a party and you don't have branches in all the regions of Ghana, you don't have presence in 2/3 of the districts in each region, you don't have at least a founding member in each district, your certificate must be cancelled.
Excellent.
That has not been done. Most of the parties we find on the EC's books are actually dead. They have just one person parading themselves around as a party.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Asah-Asante, what do you say about these three, we can call the flagship recommendations? Yes, Dr. Emmanuel Akwete.
Thank you. First of all, I think we're still looking at our democracy through the prism of elections. And that, I mean, for me, is problematic. Our democracy is also about development. And if you look at the history of political parties in Ghana, you will find out that the trauma of coups and one-party states and so on has affected our parties. Now we call them election machines, but they've been trying to do development as well. And they are parties that are supposed to build nations, unite the nation, and so on and so forth. And they're incapable of doing that. They need capacity. Because we've had close to 30 years, we are now beginning to see what our parties need or what roles they could potentially play to transform our development. And you cannot pack all into an IPAC. IPAC is an administrative entity for an independent electoral commission that needs to consult parties when it's making decisions. And so, and it's been adopted. You know, in advanced economies, there was a time what we call the tripartite committee in Ghana had similar arrangements where labor, business, and whichever entity, a state entity, you know, met to discuss issues affecting the economy and all that, and what they have to do. And what they agree, each party goes to implement and come back to report. And so it was an advisory committee. That is what it is. It didn't bind the EC, because you can't impose those things on the EC in its own act. It's independent and so on. But I think I understand what you're saying after, let's review the performance. I don't know the basis on which this legislated came from. Most of the time we make decisions without reviews to see performance, to see new challenges coming up, and ask yourself, is this body really, should we squeeze everything into it? I think it is not. So we should look outside. If you come up with the idea of regulation, truly, yes, we need regulation. If you look at how parties are financed and so on and so forth, membership dues. But in our context, because of our peculiar history, we also need to facilitate the capacity of parties to be development agents. And you cannot put it in IPAC. But it's part of our democracy. So I am not a great enthusiast of saying, just put a stamp legal. If you do that, you also must ask yourself, how does it impact the independence of EC? And what other mechanism does EC draw on administratively to facilitate decisions it wants to make? Should everything go into this structured, law-backed thing, there will be so much fight, EC will be paralyzed. So I think we need a separate entity. That's why we came up with the idea of a multi-party democracy committee. Look at the bigger things. Don't just go and regulate parties and close their offices. Also know that sometimes we owe some reparation to the parties for what we did to them over 53 years. Could we begin to see how they could develop their capacity to process policy, to agree on long-term development plans, and what the priorities are, whether you change government and all that? You cannot put it all in IPAC.
All right.
So I think we need to think outside the box and revisit that recommendation.
Okay. So I'd like you to finally give us your view on this other recommendation, which is a recommendation that in the course of the week, the media hasn't paid too much attention to, but I think is very important. At the CODEO CDD organized election reviews, I have had to also speak about it, because one of my areas of expertise is ADR, pre-litigation mediation outcome. The judiciary, all the time before elections, Dr. Kwete, you know about the election adjudication manual that they produce. Yes. And they have consistently advocated the recourse to ADR. Yes. I have been at the Chief Justice's Forum together with yourself when we were fashioning out ways for good election disputes, and this was also there. In Ghana, we have a double dozen laws that require the rather cheap non-legalese peace-building ADR first attempt. Why should we not make this mandatory for election dispute resolution as well?
Good question. I think we should find, there's a classic ADR, but it's ADR that occurred under the supervision, I understand, of the Supreme Court. Remember the pink sheets, the decisions that were made on the pink sheets before the 2016 elections. I am told that, yes, there was a writ, something that could have been litigation, but I learned that you know much more, so you can explain it better. But I learned that lawyer Akoto Ampao and the EC lawyer at the time were given a room to thrash out these issues. They came out, they've agreed. The Supreme Court stamped it and read it. And look at the wonders it performed in the 2016 elections and everything. So I think ADR is important. As to whether ADR can be managed by EC and parties alone, that I am not sure. I think because our party system has evolved into these two powerful parties, we call them duopolies, you need a state entity that has compelling power, that brings them around the table, even if you're going to administer ADR.
Okay. ADR can be done, it can be done in very many different forms. It can be institutional ADR, where the the persons who will sit and mediate it for them will be institution that will appoint them. And that will be far ahead of a dispute arising. You would even know ahead of time. You could decide that maybe former speakers of parliament can take part in it. You can decide that former Supreme Court justices or current Supreme Court justices, some of them should be part of it. You can select specific institutions to appoint the persons who will sit down and resolve these things ahead of time. And the parties will participate in all of those processes in determining these institutions ahead of time. So there can be a legislation to that effect. Like I suggested, we have laws that make it compulsory, even in our courts. There are certain cases, it is compulsory. If you don't attempt ADR first, there will not be a trial for you.
Well, it's a good point you've made, but please remember, I'm using a term that I would like Lawyer Segbefia and Lawyer Kwebu to take account of. You're dealing with political duopolies. It's unusual.
Okay.
They're extremely powerful entities.
Okay.
And where is the state institution that takes care of them? Like you have I gave some examples, the Bank of Ghana, Securities Exchange Commission, and so on. In our party sector, political party or politics sector, there is no such entity. You only have an electoral commission. And so if there is no such entity, then I would like the approach to ADR, the one that occurred on big sheets, because they knew there was a powerful authority overseeing or supervising, and they got some quick solutions and they complied. So that's all I'm saying, that our party landscape has changed, the actors have changed, and they ought to be factored in all the considerations we're making now.
Okay. Dr. Asah-Assante's connection has been very terrible. So make a quick input and let's move on.
I think that my senior brother is, for me, saying the same thing but in a different way. And it also depends on his idea of how he sees the EC. You see, if you see the EC's function, the EC is not there to develop the country. It's not a development agency. It is there to conduct our elections. It's being given other functions now with regard to formation of political parties, but it's an election body. So the body he's talking about, which would look at a separate entity, is a much broader concept, a much broader, which can still be done, but still you have to come back to what is the EC's functions, and they must be seen to be acting in a way where they can get smooth elections.
Let me get Dr. Asah-Assante, and then we can take a break, return to look at whether Shirali will give justice to those who were killed and those who were maimed or suffered injuries in the 2020 elections. But my question I'm thinking about is, what is the guarantee that this elections regulatory body we are thinking about will not be bastardized in the same way we bastardize the Electoral Commission only when we are in opposition? Yes, Dr. Asah-Assante, what do you say about the appointment of EC commissioners, splitting the EC into two, and also making the IPAC, legislative?
Yeah. The first one is parliamentary approval for EC members. I support that strongly, in the sense that if you look at the composition as we have it now and the requirement for it, if you look at Article 70, Clause 2, it tells us that the president would appoint in conjunction with the Council of State. You and I know that the Council of State is just an advisory body. It may decide to disagree with the position of the president. The president will go ahead. I believe that it's about time we scrap the Council of State and make it a second chamber, in view of the fact that this is a group of people with wealth of experience that we can tap into and build this state. But that is another conversation at another time. I believe that whoever is going to be at the position as electoral commissioner and their members must go through the people's scrutiny in Parliament, and I support that proposal.
What do you think about this? What do you think about this? The government white paper accepted the Constitution Reviews Commission's recommendation that the EC chairperson and deputy should be appointed by the president in consultation with the Council of State and with the prior approval of Parliament. The white paper was gazetted on June 15, 2012. Questioning how many years now? We have had the EC, both under Afarijan and Charlotte Osei, reject the proposal by the Electoral Reforms by the Electoral Reforms Committee to legislate IPAC.
That is very unfortunate. We spent time to do this work. If you look at Professor Fiajo's committee, the work that they did, great work, but we have put it to very little use. So if NDC have gone on their way to pick some of these issues up for us to look at it, I believe it's fine. We should make you do with that proposal. I think it's fair. And back to the issue that I was talking about, the issue of splitting EC into two. I disagree with respect with the NDC proposal, because then you are going to gradually creating a rival body that will rival EC in its activity. Because I don't see why EC chair cannot assign responsibilities to some of its subordinates to perform on behalf of the EC. So that proposal that you want to split the two, I believe it will undermine the authority and the independence of the EC. So that one, I disagree with NDC. Yes.
How about the IPAC? You say you support the IPAC being made a statutory body, as in legislating IPAC.
No, I don't support that.
Why?
That one too.
Why?
Yes, the reason is that over the years, since IPAC was established in 1994, we have seen a lot of proposals from IPAC that have done a lot of magic for this country in terms of electoral reforms. Look at from opaque ballot boxes to transparent ballot boxes, and then we're voting on 2 different dates. They propose that we do it on the same day, and so forth and so on. So if there is a good proposal, I think for the sake of maintaining the independence of the Electoral Commission and its authority, yes, they can continue to make proposals to Electoral Commission. But if you create it as a body, I'm afraid we are going to create a rival body that will challenge the authority of EC. What is more is that sometimes if you look at the posture of IPAC in recent times, you realize that a very antagonistic position, especially NDC with the EC. If there is an issue that NDC feels so strongly that we need to implement head on, and IPAC, the EC has a different position. If you don't take care, it's going to drag, and we can, it can hold all of us to a ransom. And that is my fears, because if we are not able to satisfy some of these requirements, if there is a proposal that EC says, well, I'm not going to buy by that, and then we go ahead, sometimes we can run into constitutional crisis. So I believe that the architecture that we have now, let's maintain it so that we don't run into constitutional crisis. Whatever proposal, if they are brilliant, they are useful. Okay. I think the EC will look at it and then factor it into its calculation, and then we can make effective use of it.
Thank you so very much for your views there. And we're taking a quick break. When we return, I'll read some of your messages on this subject to you, and then we proceed to 2 members of parliament who have brought up the issue of people who suffered injuries and those who died in the election 2020 to Shraj to look at.